I think both sides are worried about how cyberspace affects core national interests, security and economic interests, and both have pivoted to trying to shape international cyberspace, the rules, the technology, the behaviors. I think the pivot is in some ways more surprising in the Chinese case. We had often conceived of China as being very inwardly focused on cyberspace, filtering technology, keeping information out, what we broadly know as the Great Firewall. But the fact is that China increasingly now sees the ability to shape international cyberspace as important to its domestic concerns. And I think the US was in part caught unaware by that. It was slow to react. And now is trying to, I think, regain some of the initiative on how you think about, define the rules of behavior. I think the problem is, one, the breadth of the competition seems unbounded. So both sides increasingly see the competition as zero-sum and don't have a lot of areas where they have cooperative interests. And the other is that the rules of the competition are uncertain and unknown. Certainly on the actual operations side, on what type of hacking might be legitimate or what types of behavior might be legitimate, there is a divide between the two actors. The US for a long time has tried to convince the world that there are certain types of hacking that would be legitimate. Most of those would be political military, which is, countries always have spied and they will continue to spy, and we cannot expect any real international regulation of that. But the theft of industrial secrets through cyber-enabled means should be considered illegitimate and has brought pressure on China to accept that norm. China briefly seemed to accept that norm, but now the agreement between the US and China on hacking seems to no longer being followed. So there's clearly some space for competition and misunderstanding there. I think the other worrying issue is that on the rules for cyber conflict, or what we might consider cyber war, both sides also have very different understanding of application of international law and other norms. And so you can imagine that a crisis or other type of political tensions in the South China Sea or Taiwan Straits could escalate in ways that neither side truly wants or could control. So it is very hard to find right now shared interest, common interest. And that really, part of it is cyber, right? I think part of it is the how far apart the two sides are on common cyber understandings, but a lot of it just has to do about the state of the US-China relationship right now is so lacking in trust that it's hard to figure out where that space would be. That said, not trying to fight the scenario, there are clearly some areas where there should be shared concern. The first one is the one that I already alluded to, which is that neither side wants cyber issues to spill over into the physical world because of miscalculation, right? Neither side wants to be dragged into something that they weren't planning for, and so here, bilateral or multilateral or through the UN discussions about thresholds for the use of force during an armed attack, some common shared conceptions about escalatory ladders or discussions about that, because there's a lot of worrying differences between how the two sides talk about deterrence in cyberspace. And for example, in some of the open source Chinese writings, what they consider an attack that would kind of a deterrent value from a Western or a US perspective would seem to be a failure of deterrence. So in some cases, Chinese writers say, well, you can restore deterrence by taking out the adversary's command and control systems. Well, from a US perspective, that would not be a deterrent movement. That would be a failure of deterrence. You're already escalated. So trying to get some understanding there. And there were forum for that. There was a strategic and economic dialogue between the two sides, a number of track 2s and 1.5s, and then the UN process through the group of government experts. All of those right now are, have their own political problems. The bilateral discussions aren't happening. Track 1.5s have really kind of, as far as I can tell, slowed down. And the UN GGE process, the last meeting had this serious disagreement about application of international law, and now we have two processes with the UN GGE and the open-ended working group. So I don't think there's a lot of, unfortunately right now there's not a lot of progress on that side. Those discussions could also talk about some shared value, I think, and shared interest in protecting the basis of the internet. So, people talk about the domain name system and other kind of core systems of the internet, which neither side really has a huge amount of desire to see go down. It would have a damaging effect on both of the economies, and there might be some shared interest in talking about targets that should be off limits, the financial system. So I think there are shared interests. I'm not sure there's the political ability or desire right now to work on them. I think there's, as you point out, there's kind of two processes going on. There is a kind of norms discussion and norms generation, which is happening both and the kind of the multilateral level, right? So the UN process we've talked about, some of the bilateral discussions, and is also happening with non-state actors, right? So the Global Commission on Stability and the Microsoft Convention and the Paris Accord, which is a kind of mixture of state and non-state actors. So I think there's a lot happening that's as we always say with the internet, multi-stakeholder, and then there's actual state behavior, so what states do and what they take responsibility for, and we're seeing more of that, right? So the U.S. has now, conducted several offensive cyber operations and said, yes, we did that, and that is why we did them. Here are the justifications for why we did them. So those are, I think, are two processes. Who becomes the arbitrator? I think the issue is, unfortunately, there is no arbiter, and we're seeing a split between what we might call like-minded groups, and we saw that just last week when we had the U.S. and Australia and the U.K. and about 8 or 9 other partners, the Dutch and others, attribute the Russian attacks on Georgia in 2018. So here is a set of like-minded countries saying, here is a behavior, we've attributed it to specific Russian actors. This behavior is unacceptable international behavior, and we reserve the right to sanction it. So I think you're going to start seeing that, and we've started seeing that process happen more often. But that is in many ways going to accelerate what people are already talking about, which is a splinter net or bifurcation or decoupling, or however you want to talk about it. I think there's a political issue, as you said, is that in almost all of the cases, you are not relying simply on digital forensics. You're drawing on other intelligence means, and so, as you said, there's a kind of decision that policymakers have to make about, is it worth burning those technical means to score the political points on the attribution, and then you have to convince both your partners and the rest of the world that this intelligence is legitimate. So there's clearly those political costs. I think the other issue is that, as you alluded to, those resources are not evenly distributed in the world, right? Attribution is hard, but it's harder for some than others. I mean, we've seen some small players, the Dutch in particular, have moved up and demonstrated some significant capabilities. But there's lots of countries that don't have those attribution capabilities. And so then you get into the issue of, well, can only some countries attribute and others can't? I think there were attempts to try and address that concern through third-party attribution. And I think, again, referring back to non-state actors, Microsoft had been floating this idea of a third-party attribution center. They've set up this Cyber Peace Institute. It doesn't seem as if it's going to actually play that role. There's lots of kind of complicated issues about how you would share the threat intel. But I think it is a real problem, and it's one that I think has made it harder to bring in countries outside of the Five Eyes or others with close intelligence sharing with the United States into this naming and shaming and sanctioning regime. I think, as you said, the companies themselves are I think uniquely powerful in this space compared to what we saw before in the energy sector, or clearly companies before have had foreign policies, right? The U.S. fruit companies involved in supporting regimes in Latin America, and the oil companies and everything else. But the digital companies, I think, both because they control the networks and because they control the data on so many countries' citizens, I think have a unique type of power. And you can't imagine some type of shared set of norms or stability without the companies playing a larger role. I think the problem is in all of the societies, there's an inherent tension between what the companies want to do and national security and national economic interests, right? The companies are global platforms. And we saw this, really splash into the open after the Snowden revelations. The companies, after the revelations from Snowden, made a point of stressing that they were global actors with users around the world, and that they were going to defend their users, which meant also from the NSA. So that, increases the tensions between what the companies want to succeed in doing and what the governments want to do. At the same time, as we've seen Chinese companies globalize and also should have similar tensions, the party in China is actually tightening control over the companies, increasing party representation, the national intelligence law, which seems to suggest that all the companies have to play a role in the intelligence gathering. So the companies are, and I think it's clearly true for American companies, true for Chinese companies, are always suspect in third-party countries, right? They're always going to be seen as playing some role in intelligence gathering or power projection or some influence there. So it really complicates the role that I think the companies can play, and makes this an even more difficult space to imagine that you're going to have one set of norms, one set of agreements that everyone ascribes to. I really do think we're moving to a set of, unfortunately, like-minded or different groups of, this is how we control the internet, this is how we're going to behave, and if you're going to act in this space, then this is the rules we expect you to follow. I think the diplomatic challenges we are working, I think, toward this bifurcated space. So then it becomes very much a challenge of trying to bridge values, which is not an easy thing to do on the diplomatic front. It's easier to point out where you might have some shared interests, where it is in the self-interest of all countries to act in a similar way. But the more that cyberspace is seen to reflect democratic values or governance systems, then it becomes, I think, increasingly hard for diplomats to bridge that space. I think the second is, as you alluded to, is just the technical challenge. Is we struggle to get diplomats and analysts and others who had expertise in the digital world to start thinking about international relations and foreign policy, or we struggle to get people who had foreign policy experience to start thinking about digital issues. And we've maybe reached a point now where I think we have a fairly growing center of gravity, that we have a number of cyber coordinators in ministries across the world. The GGE process has been going on now for more than a decade. So there's I think a growing center of it. But we're now going to be caught with a new wave of innovation driven by AI and quantum and 5G. And So we're going to have to do it all again in some ways. And those, again, we're going to have a problem with expertise and talent and things there. So that's all I think the negative. I think on the positive side, we see that coming, and I think we can draw on lessons from what we learned in this last decade on the digital front. How do we attract the right type of people? I think we've gotten better at. Clearly, as we've alluded to earlier, there's no way of dealing with these problems that's not going to be multi-stakeholder, or multilateral, right? So there's no one country that can address all these issues. They're going to need partners, and those partners are going to be both within their own societies and internationally. And so they're going to have to draw on expertise in a whole range of places that they, traditionally foreign ministries would have not been tapping into.